Hey, welcome back to the Backyard Professor Chess videos. Let's do a study of the Ruy Lopez Open. One of my subscribers requested I do some openings, and I think it's time now. I looked at some Ruy Lopez earlier, a few years back in some of my early videos. I'm going to use some Paul Morphy games and some Bobby Fischer games and possibly some Alexander Alekhine or J.R. Capablanca games. And let's take a look at how to handle the Ruy Lopez. This is a game played by Morphy versus Lowenthal in the Ruy Lopez. Morphy is white. So we've got the e4, e5, the typical opening. They're hitting the squares in the center. Knight f3, reinforcing and hitting the king pawn, and knight c6. This is a typical, classical Ruy Lopez. a6 to threaten the knight. And bishop goes to a4. He's not going to relinquish the knight check just yet. And then Lowenthal brings up the other knight. Straight up the center, d4. The Ruy Lopez idea for black is to keep that pawn. But for white, it's to attack that pawn, right? So here we go. Well, this pawn takes the pawn. So he got rid of the pawn, but he did it through a pawn exchange. And now he pushes the e5 pawn. Morphy is already hitting a target, and the knight comes up to e4. And Morphy will castle. So the castling has taken place. Knight e to c5, and then Lowenthal pulls his knight back. So he's moving a lot of knight moves, and Morphy goes ahead and decides to take the knight. He said, let's get rid of the knight. He retakes with the queen pawn. Nowadays, most will retake with the B pawn instead of the D pawn, but we're talking the 1800s here. So this will be kind of interesting to see how that affects this particular game. I know Nimzovich in his book My System did not like the idea of retaking with the queen pawn because he was so eccentric about the center that he said taking this way moves you away from the center, whereas taking with the B pawn points you toward the center. But, I mean, the pawn still has the same influence. It also opens up the file on the queen. Yeah? So it's kind of interesting to see how they argue back and forth on that. Brings back his knight to e6, and Morphy takes the knight. And then the bishop, good developing move by taking that knight. And Morphy develops his queen, protecting his pawn. His pawn is fairly advanced, so he wants to, it's all by itself out there. He wants to give it just a little bit of protection at this point. And then he brings his other bishop up here, getting his bishop out. Morphy's developing with the knight. Lowenthal brings out the queen. Morphy puts the knight on the e-file. His opponent puts the bump with the h-pawn. Morphy brings his bishop, hitting the other bishop. They will exchange the bishops. Bishop takes and queen takes. Doesn't mess up his kingside pawn, although that would have opened, putting the f here would have opened the file, but it would have doubled the pawns. Morphy didn't want to do that, so he retook with the queen this time. Bishop bumps to put the question to the knight. The knight bumps back and puts the question to the bishop. And the bishop takes the pawn. Juicy little pawn, but that wasn't such a hot move. There was a question mark in the text, but no explanation. Morphy pushes his f-pawn. g6. He's going to bump up. Notice he hasn't castled yet. Still in the middle. And so Morphy is pushing that e-pawn for all he's worth. He's going to try to open up to get to the king if he's not going to castle. That is a strategy that's usually used. Bishop comes back up to f5, and the knight will take the bishop at f5. Morphy's wanting to protect that passed pawn. Blockaded at the moment, but it's passed. No pawns obstructing it, just a queen and a king. And the pawn takes the pawn and goes check to the king, and now the king will take the pawn. Shucks, we were hoping to see a queen, weren't we? But we didn't get to see the queen. Now, Morphy comes across this way to h3, hitting targets. Neither one of them have taken an open file necessarily with the rooks just yet, until right now. Morphy's the first to put the rook on the open file, and Lowenthal challenges, says, well, wait a minute. And Morphy, I've seen this in other games too. This is kind of an interesting maneuver. Rather than take the file, but technically Morphy would lose the file if he took the rook because the other rook would take, and then Morphy couldn't challenge him. But he does put it on an outpost. Kind of interesting. He also has a target. The queen is back in that square, and then his opponent loses the queen. So this is pretty interesting, and of course he's going to eliminate that possibility by moving the king to g6. Morphy doubles up the rooks on the file. The rook will take the rook. Yeah, you have to do that. You have to do that. And the rook will take the rook. So Morphy ends up with the file on the outpost. Very nice. Going at the king. Both with a queen on this side and a rook on this side. Going that away. Very interesting setup here, isn't it? Rook to d8. Grabs the file. Could come after the king. Queen simply comes over here and goes check to the king. King dodges back behind the pawn, so it's not a crisis. And Morphy pushes the h. So he's going to slowly advance toward that king. You notice he's outgunned with pawns on this side. So he better hope he can keep his opponent occupied over here, right? Because if his opponent starts sensing, hey, I can start running pawns, Morphy could have a very interesting, tricky situation here. Although he's a long way away. Rook goes to d7. Queen comes over to e3, backing up the rook. b6, okay, he's going to start arranging his pawns on the queen's side. So Morphy instantly pushes the king up. c5, here we go. He's going to want to start pushing those pawns. And really, I mean, you're outgunned here. It's time to push pawns. So Morphy has to start acting quickly on this side, or he could have himself a heck of a game. As far as dominating the center, I think they're both doing fine that way. Morphy has the pawn majority over here, but all pieces are over here. So it seems to me like it'll be tougher for Morphy to bump pawns in than it will for Lowenthal if he will hurry with that. Right? Fold this so I can see this easier. I wrote this down on a thin piece of paper. c5. I got the c5. Okay, queen to e2. Queen to g6. Could get a good attack here. However, target. Yeah, I mean, you've got the file. You're backed up with the queen. Hit the queen. Truly. Hopefully, she'll bump back one. Of course, then you couldn't keep going up, but actually she did bump back one for his sake, and then queen came to h5. So there's some pressure here. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Rook to d5. Morphy bumps the b3. kind of keeping his eye on this side. The pawns are slowly but steadily moving here. Morphy takes out one of the pawns. Wise. Yeah, that pawn majority is too strong. It's still a majority where it can get through, possibly, depending on how you play it. Rook to d6. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? Challenge that rook right now, because your pawns, you want to bump your pawns in, and you can do it with the help of the queen, hopefully. There's too much going on here. There's pretty good chance for black to get in. So that makes sense. However, queen takes f5 check. Morphy is going to keep the initiative. He's also going to hit the target. He's also going to eliminate some pawns. Makes this endgame easier, doesn't it? And he says, let's trade the queens. And Morphy does. He takes the queen, and he takes the queen. So now we are in a rook-pawn endgame. This will be real interesting to see how either one of them handles it. Target. Yes, you have to attack that majority of pawns. No question about that. That is the proper procedure. Rook to b6, he wants to protect those pawns too, because he can control this with the king at this point. This is where the emphasis is. But Morphy's going to get hopping on the move quick, and now he's going to make sure those double pawns stay together to give support as much to that lead pawn as he can. That's good strategy. King g3, h5. You may as well trade off one of those. Rook to a7. Morphy wants to come around from behind. H takes the g pawn. H takes the g pawn. And now we see an inkling of the potential win here, don't we? This could get iffy quick for black. F5, he's pushing. You notice, instead of reacting more or less, over here, Morphy is simply taking command with the initiative and keeping it going. He's keeping his opponent occupied. He's cleared out all the pawns. Now he's going to push like crazy no matter what, because his pawns are closer unobstructed than his pawns are. So this is a really good, interesting. Did I push f5? Yes. King to e5, and now rook e7 check. Come behind the king. King to d6, contacting the rook and coming over here to support the pawns so he can push them down. And f6, nice. Nice move. Look at how he handled that. Rather than retreat the rook, advance the pawn. One square closer to the queening. Morphy's pawn is making better progress than his opponent's. That's real nice to see. Rook to b8. He's making a lot of rook moves instead of getting his pawns going. Yeah, that's because that passed pawn is really powerful. You can just see it draw that rook over there like a magnet, can't you? Now watch what Morphy does. Yeah, if you're gonna push the F pawn, go ahead and push the G pawn. Notice who is getting their pawns to advance and who isn't. That's the lesson here. This is pretty good to watch. Yeah, that's nice. And then rook to f8. He's on defense because Morphy insisted, I'm gonna get my pawns going. And the power of that passed pawn beat his opponent. Very cool to see how this works. And of course, don't leave your king out of it. Let your king escort your pawns all the way. c4, too little too late. B takes, and B takes, and King F5. keep right into the thick of it. C3. You think, hey, wait a minute. That looks like he might make it. Nope. Rook E3. And here is where Lowenthal resigned. Or Lowenthal resigned. Because he's going to get the pawn, then he's going to come back here and bust those pawns in. So, and he can still work both sides. He has a completely passed pawn here, free of charge, and two here that will occupy the rook. So the rook can escort this one in. He'll make the king go on defensive measures to block that pawn, and he'll put his rook behind that pawn, and the king will park right there, and in the meantime this king will waltz those pawns in. That's a great endgame study too, isn't it? So there's one Ruy Lopez opening with Paul Morphy as white. Let's check out in the next video a Ruy Lopez that Paul Morphy played against Adolf Anderson, and Morphy was the black piece. So this will be kind of interesting to see. So thanks for watching my Backyard Professor Chess videos. I'm trying to keep these to about 15 to 20 minutes, hopefully not too much longer. I've been combining a couple of games in videos, and that doesn't seem to be encouraging to people. You just like to see one game per video, whether it's 12 minutes or 25. So that is what I will do. In the meantime, stay tuned. Another Paul Morphy game coming right up. Be good, do well, have fun, and keep watching, keep studying, keep learning, and keep having an enjoyable life. Life is to be lived happily. I will see you guys in the next chess video.